begin. We are going to continue with our discussions on the teachings of Lord Caitanya, but we will begin from Kirtan. Nama Om Vishnu Padaya Krishna Pristaya Bhutale Srimate Bhakti Vedanta Swami Iti Namine Nama Om Vishnu Padaya Krishna Pristaya Bhutale Srimate Bhakti Vedanta Swami Iti Namine Namaste Saraswati Devi Gauravani Pacharine Nirvishesha Shunyapadi Bhaktivyadishatarine Namaste Saraswati Devi Gauravani Pacharine Nirvishesha Shunyapadi Bhaktivyadishatarine Jai Shri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Shri Advaitam Gadadhar Srivasadi Gaura Bhaktivinoda Jaya Shri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Shri Advaita Gadadhar Srivasadi Gaura Bhaktivinoda Hare Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama 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 Hare 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 Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama 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 Hare 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 Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama 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 Hare 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 Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama 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 Hare 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 Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama 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 Hare 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 Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama 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 Hare 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 Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama 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 Hare 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 Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama 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 Hare 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 Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama Rama Hare 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 Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama 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 Hare 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 Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama 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 Hare 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 Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama 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 Hare 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 Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama 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 Hare Hare Bol Hari Bol Hari Bol Gaura Hari Bol Nitai Gaura Hari Bol Hari Bol Hari Bol Jai Gaura Hari Bol Jaya Jaya Prabhupada Jaya Prabhupada Jaya Jaya Prabhupada Jaya Jaya Prabhupada Krishnakai Gaura Hari Ki Jai, Shri Prabhupada Ki Jai, Krishnakai Gaura Premi Devi Dasi. Again, thank you all so much for joining us this evening. We're going to continue our discussions of the teachings of Lord Caitanya, starting with our prayers. Om Jnana-timirandasya Gnananjana-shalakaya Churanninitam Yena Tasmai Shri Gurave Namaha. Shri Chaitanya Manobhishtam Sthapitam Yena Bhutale Murpakadamahyam Dati Swapadantikam Ma Om Vishnupadaya Krishna Prestaya Bhutale Srimate Bhaktivedanta Swami Namine Namaste Saraswati Deve Gauravani Pacharine Nirvishesha Shrinivari Paschati Deshatarine. So we're going to continue our discussion on the teachings of Lord Caitanya. This is a wonderful book that was written by Srila Prabhupada, our founder Acharya of National Society of Krishna Consciousness. And this book is based on the official biography of Lord Caitanya Mahaprabhu, one of his official biographies called the Caitanya Charitamrita. And this book was written by Srila Krishnadas Kaviraj Goswami. So I thank you all for the opportunity to serve by presenting this overview, and pray for all your blessings to be justice to this class. Last week we started our discussions on the 20th chapter, and this is the second part of those discussions. The chapter is called The Goal of Vedanta Study. So Lord Caitanya Mahaprabhu is meeting with Mayavadi sannyasis in the city of Benares, now called Varanasi, and here they are discussing in particular the question of the Mayavadi sannyasis, but why Lord Caitanya Mahaprabhu didn't study the Vedanta. So the Lord had answered their questions very beautifully, and now they're asking him what's wrong with Vedanta. So his explanation to them centers on the fact that they're understanding Vedanta in the wrong way. So we had begun with his explanation last week. We'll continue with it today, and we will chant the invocation prayer, the first verse of the Chaitanya Charita, the 18th verse of the first chapter of the Chaitanya Charitamrita. Jaya Jaya Shri Chaitanya Jaya Nityananda Jaya Advaita Chandra Jaya Gaura Bhakta Vrinda Jaya Jaya Shri Chaitanya Jaya Nityananda Jaya Advaita Chandra Jaya Gaura Bhakta Vrinda Jaya Jaya Shri Chaitanya Jaya Nityananda Jaya Advaita Chandra Jaya Gaura Bhakta Vrinda. The translation is: Glory to Shri Chaitanya and Nityananda, glory to Advaita Chandra, and glory to all the devotees of Shri Gaura, Lord Chaitanya. So we will read in the Vishnu Purana 6.761. It is clearly stated: Vishnu Shakti Para Prokta Kshetra Gyatya Tata Para Avidya Karma Sangyanya. Okay, apologies for that. We were interrupted. We'll read the verse again. Vishnu Shakti Para Prokta Kshetra Gyatya Tata Para Avidya Karma Sangyanya Tritiya Shakti Rishyate. And the translation is: the energy of the Supreme Lord is divided into three: Para, Kshetragya, and Avidya. The Para energy is actually the energy of the Supreme Lord himself. The Kshetragya energy is the living entity, and the Avidya energy is the material world or Maya. It is called avidya, or ignorance, because under the spell of this material energy one forgets his actual position and his relationship with the Supreme Lord. The conclusion is that the living entities represent one of the energies of the Supreme Lord. As infinitesimal parts and parcels of the Supreme, they are called jivas. If the jivas are artificially placed on the same level with the infinite Supreme, because both of them are Brahman or Spirit, then bewilderment will certainly be the result. So this is a nice summary to begin with of the concept we had discussed last week. We had spoke about the position of the Supreme Lord. And here he is being called Para. So Para, of course, means supreme or superior, or a greater force in relation, of course, to another force, and that is the living entity. So the living entity is Atma, and the Supreme Lord is Paramatma, Para. And the living entity is a Brahman, and the Supreme Lord is Parabrahma, the Supreme Brahman. So in this way, we can understand the position of the Lord is always superior to the living entities. They're never on the same level as him. The living entities are called herein Kshetragya. Okay, so Kshetragya is a term that we may have read in the 13th chapter of Bhagavad Gita. Kshetragya means knower of the field. Kshetra is field and Gya is knower. So what field are we talking about? The field we're referring to is the body. The body is known as the field of activity, and one who resides within the body and is aware of everything that's going on in the body is the knower of the field. Kshetragya. So we can take it with the example of a house. Right? There's a lot of activity going on in anyone's house at any given point in time, and the person who lives there is aware of all those activities. So they are the knower of the house. And therefore, sometimes we hear people complaining that only they know what's going on in their house at any given point in time. So in the same way, we know what is going on in our bodies. I don't know what's going on in your body, and you don't know what's going on in mine. But the Supreme Personality of Godhead, He's para, He's above us. So He is aware of what is going on in everyone's body at the same time, because He is everywhere as the Paramatma, para again. So the duty as the small knowers, as the small Brahmans, as a small soul, is to serve the para, to serve the Lord. But we fall into ignorance. And this is why we forget that relationship, and then we descend into illusion. So the illusion is called Maya, and in this verse, the illusion is also referred to as avidya, which of course makes sense because ignorance and avidya are analogous concepts. If you have an understanding of what is truth or what is reality, then illusion can't affect you. So we'll take another example. In some fun fairs, there's often a booth or a tent where mirrors, illusory mirrors, are placed, and the mirrors make your body look very distorted, too tall, too fat, strange shapes. So you won't be bewildered by seeing such an image because you know the reality of what your body looks like in real life. If you look in the mirror, though, it will look completely different. So on the basis of your knowledge, you can understand that that mirror is an illusion, what it's showing you. So the problem is that the living entities have forgotten the reality. They come to this material world, they don't remember that they're servants of the Supreme Lord. And this ignorance of their real position is the exact way that material nature can convince us of the illusion of what the false ego tells us we are. And we believe that as reality because we don't know any better. We don't know the truth. So since ignorance is key to illusion, then knowledge, true knowledge, must be key to getting out of illusion. The problem is that the knowledge must be the kind that can really defeat avidya. So the Mayavadis, for example, we also discussed them last week that they do have knowledge. Their knowledge, particularly in the process they follow, is called Jnana Yoga. But their knowledge doesn't free them completely of the false ego. It still allows them to believe through the false belief that they can be God. And certainly that means they can't understand the opposite concept, being a servant of God. So their knowledge is maybe getting them out of the false ego, believing an identity of this world, fair enough. But it doesn't get them fully out of the false ego, where they would give up all ideas of being in control, and then take on the real ego, the reality, which is of being a servant. So basically, their knowledge can only tell them what they're not, can't tell them what they are. Right? So bhakti is real knowledge. Bhakti allows us not only to defeat the false ego, to defeat all the false concepts of what we are. Bhakti also takes us out of what we call, what Sri Prabhupada calls the last snare of Maya. The last snare of Maya is to believe that we are God. That's the last illusion that the living entity falls under. And Bhakti gets us out of that illusion and then places us into the right identity, the right ego, devotional service. This is where we get the understanding of exactly who we are, who the Supreme Lord is, what our relationship is. The stage, of course, begins as Ashtakti progresses through Bhava and Prema, we've discussed that before. And this is how we're situated in our natural condition by the development of true knowledge, Bhakti. So what exactly is the problem with the Mayavadis believing that they can be God? They get out of the false ego to a very large degree, right? That should be a good thing. So the first is that if we believe that we are God, then we become bewildered. So we can understand this in an everyday concept. His case, Atul Krishna Prabhu explains it like this. We try to be little gods, little controllers of lots of things. We want to be controllers of our home, and it's very difficult because something's always going wrong. Something's leaking, something's breaking, something's not working the way we want to do. We're not getting along with whoever's in the house. Then there's if we are trying to be controllers of business, it's difficult. There's always something going wrong there as well. It's never plain sailing. There's a lot of work that's involved in it. Ditto for trying to be a controller of a country. Wherever we go, wherever we're under this idea that we can be controller, there's always going to be challenges and difficulties. We can see that every day in the media. Influential people who are controllers of something or the other, wealth, fame, businesses, they're always saying something wrong, doing something wrong, associating with the wrong company, endorsing something wrong. It's a minefield, basically. The only perfect rulers or controllers among the jivas have been those who have taken shelter of the Supreme Lord. And that's because they're acting as servants of the Lord. They're acting in their proper condition. They may be in a position of ruler, but they're ruling as servants. Anytime that we try to rule anything as a controller, we're always going to get it wrong. It's always going to lead us to bewilderment. So if we think that we're God, in that bewildered state, we're going to be misleading people, misguiding, giving the wrong information, and so on. So we can see the problem. We're trying to be God, which is a completely artificial state for the living entity who can never get it right. Generally, Mayavadi philosophers are perplexed before learned Vaishnava because the Mayavadis cannot explain the cause of bondage of the living entities. They simply say it is due to ignorance. But they cannot explain how the living entities can be covered by ignorance if they are supreme. The actual reason is that the living entities, although qualitatively one with the Supreme, are infinitesimal, not infinite, infinitesimal, small. Had they been infinite, there would have been no possibility of their being covered by ignorance. Because the living entity is infinitesimal, he can be covered by an inferior energy. So we have discussed this before to the degree that the Mayavadis cannot explain how this material existence came about. They also can't explain how the living entities, who happen to be God according to them, can even fall into this material world. And they do know that they need knowledge to get out of the spell of false ego. This is why they actually criticized Lord Caitanya in the first place, because they expected him to understand Vedanta, understanding God, of course, to get out of the material illusion. But they don't know what they're going to do with that knowledge after they become Brahman. Because when they become Brahman, they lose all individuality. You lose everything about you, your knowledge, your creative abilities, your desires, everything. Everything goes, the whole personality. All they know is that once they become Brahman, they become God. They are feeling at that stage of self-realization the qualities of the soul, eternity, the bliss, and so on. And because they're in that, it is quite a wonderful state to achieve, the Brahma Bhuta platform that Krishna describes in chapter 18. But it doesn't mean that at that point you become God. Because they think that, they actually start referring to each other as Narayan, right? They think that Narayan is just some jiva like them who has realized his Brahman state through some process of self-realization and therefore has become very powerful. So they think that through their process of jnana, they have achieved the same. But they don't explain where the powers are, because Narayan, of course, is all powerful. And even though we Brahman, are they able to apprehend criminals with superpowers like the Lord destroys the demons? Are they able to expand themselves even into one incarnation, much less countless, like the Bhagavatam describes? Just one incarnation that looks completely different, that acts completely different, not like a replica, like the yogis can. Can they be the knowers of all bodies, all people, the knowers of what everyone is thinking at any given point in time across the universe, right? Of everyone, just one or two people around it, everyone. Can they create a universe? We're not saying like many universes, but like the Lord creates countless universes, just one universe. Right? Can they manifest a child alone, as Garbhodakshaya Vishnu manifests Brahma without the need of Lakshmi Devi? Can they speak another Bhagavad Gita or another Vedanta, or write another Vedanta, like the Lord did in different ways? Can they expand themselves like Vamanadev across the universe? Can they show themselves to have a universal form, or even a form like Krishna did in the Battle of Kurukshetra? Can they actually demonstrate any proof that they have become infinite, except showing infinite foolishness in claiming it? Right? The truth is that someone who's reached the Brahma Bhuta platform but is not covered with ignorance still like the Mayavadi, when they feel that bliss of Brahman, they also realize their smallness in relation to the great Supreme Lord. They understand their position as a servant and not as the Supreme, because someone who is not under the illusion that they can be God will realize that the soul, as Srila Prabhupada is explaining, is infinitesimal. Therefore, this big avidya potency is simply too large for the living entity to overcome on its own. The Supreme Lord, however, is infinitely great. So the avidya potency is small compared to the Lord. Right? We are describing that para means that in relation to everything else, the Lord is supreme. So he is so great, we could say, so infinitely large that a small potency like avidya cannot cover him. But certainly, avidya is greater than us. We are actually so tiny that we can come under ourselves. So we can actually understand these esoteric concepts even in terms of size. Srila was explaining it stuff very nicely. So understanding then, Sri Prabhupada actually gave us a very nice example. He was speaking to his disciples once, and they were they were on a morning walk. I forget where, forgive me. But he saw the crabs, little crabs, scuttling into the ocean as they were walking towards it. So he asked his disciples what it means, and the disciples had different reasons based on our understanding that the crabs can sense us, and therefore they. The Prophet said that the reason why the crabs are going into the ocean is because they know they're small and they need to take shelter of someone greater than their perceived enemy, right? Which is of course the humans walking towards it. So this is to paraphrase Sri Prabhupada, but they're taking shelter of something great, the ocean. So simply, we who are so small, we stand no chance against avidya. But if we take shelter of the great, the one who is greater than avidya, then he will give us protection. We will get out of that ignorance, and we will be safe in his infinite protection. Right? So when we reach Brahma Bhuta, this is what we realize, and then this is of course now we're comparing it to the 3 stages on devotional service. So Mandagyan, then we can engage in avidya after that point, devotional, pure devotional service. The foolishness and ignorance of the Mayavadis are revealed when they try to explain how the infinite can be covered by ignorance. It is offensive to attempt to qualify the infinite by arguing that he is subject to the spell of ignorance. So the Mayavadis, in wanting to show how they can be God by jnana, it means they have to show that Krishna, Narayan, Lord Vishnu, that they at some point were in avidya and that they came out of it by some process, right? This is extremely offensive and extremely wrong. They can never prove at all that before Lord Narayan or Lord Vishnu were engaged in any creation of the universes, that they had to perform some jnana yoga or some mystic yoga, and therefore they could get out of avidya and start performing the wonderful activities they do. And certainly they can't prove that Krishna ever did the same. In fact, when we look at Lord Krishna's extraordinary learning abilities, this is now in reference to the 45th chapter of the Krishna book, the Lord, in his superhuman way, was able to learn every science, art, language, literature, agricultural subject, sports, culture, social and spiritual science there is, everything, right? He was also learning other amazing things. He was able to speak to animals, to tell the future, manipulate desire, and so on. So it's pretty extraordinary to read the list. You can check it out in the 45th chapter of Krishna book, and we will read just a few lines on how long it took him to learn all of this. After hearing only once from their teacher, Krishna and Balaram learned all the science, arts, and sciences. In 64 days and 64 nights, they learned all the necessary arts and sciences required in human society. everything, 64 days. During the daytime, they took lessons on a subject from the teacher, and by nightfall, they were experts in that department. Right? So this is from Krishna book, chapter 45. So, of course, in the history of human society, there's never been a jiva who could ever do such a thing, but that's because no jiva is God. We have to note, though, Srila Prabhupada clarifies in this chapter that Krishna knows everything. He knows, well, his knowledge is infinite, so what we have described here is only a fraction. Right? He was just setting the example for us. He was setting the example that we have. Okay, I apologize for that because that affected again. So we were saying that Krishna knows everything. He didn't have to undergo a teaching process, and certainly not just a limited number of subjects. It may seem quite a lot to us, but compared to his infinite knowledge, just a drop in the infinite ocean. But the Lord was setting an example. He was setting an example that in the human society, we have to take a guru, the shelter of a guru. We have to, as he explains in Bhagavad Gita in the 4th chapter, that we have to render service, we have to inquire submissively, and in particular, he offered Guru Dakshin. So this is something that we must do. But the Lord, following the principle, though, performed it with a supernatural act. So this is something only God can do. He offered to bring back the son of his teacher. So where was he bringing the son back from? From the dead. So the Mayavadis may claim that the Lord was human, but nobody can bring back anyone from the dead. So we don't mean that he stopped someone from dying, if that's possible. It doesn't mean that the person just died and he brought them back. That's also in some medical cases possible. This boy was dead for a long time and he brought him back, and that's never been done. Right? This is because Krishna is God and he can do these things. Right? So he was teaching us a human principle of how to serve the Guru. But he was doing it through his supernatural act. So we have to catch the hint of what we have to pay attention to here. We have to pay attention to the principle of what he's teaching us. So we read in Bhagavad Gita chapter 3, text 22 to 24. O son of Krita, there is no work prescribed for me within all the 3 planetary systems. Nor am I in want of anything, nor have I a need to obtain anything. And yet I am engaged in prescribed duties. Or if I ever fail to engage in carefully performing prescribed duties or paths, certainly all men would follow my path. If I did not perform prescribed duties, all these worlds would be put to ruination. I would be the cause of creating unwanted population, and I would thereby destroy the peace of all living beings. So the Lord is setting the example for us to be good and ideal human beings, devotees of Him. But He's not telling us to become God and try and replicate His superhuman activities or supernatural acts, which we can never do. Right? So we have to follow the principles of what the Lord is teaching us to be good humans and good devotees. We must never try to become God. But human beings are always getting those two things mixed up. And so because of that, all of that misunderstanding in the or gosh, I'm really sorry about all these interruptions. And what's better now? I just moved the GPS to a different location. So because the Lord came to teach us how to live properly as human beings, He was the perfect father, the perfect son, the perfect husband, the perfect citizen, the perfect follower of Sanatana Dharma. Right? But we still, instead of learning all of that from Him, we want to actually become Him, become God. Then He comes as His own devotee. He comes as Lord Caitanya Mahaprabhu, so we can't mistake the lessons this time. And we'll just learn from the Lord how to be a good human and a good devotee without actually trying to become God, which is the problem in modern society. Although Shankara attempted to cover the Supreme Lord by his Mayavad philosophy, he was simply following the order of the Supreme Lord. It should be understood that his teachings were a timely necessity, but not a permanent fact. So we've explained that he came to teach this philosophy because of driving on Buddhism. In the Vedanta Sutra, the distinction between the energy and the energetic is accepted from the very beginning. The second aphorism of the Vedanta Sutra, Janmadi Astayataha, clearly states that the Supreme Absolute Truth is the source of all emanations. Thus, the emanations are the energy of the Supreme, whereas the Supreme himself is the energetic. So we had said in the Vedanta Sutras that the first aphorism or the first sutra, it states that now let us inquire about the absolute truth. So now means after we have done with everything, material enjoyment, chasing after all kinds of unnecessary goals in the material world, we leave everything aside and we inquire about the absolute truth. What is God? And the next statement is Janmayadi Asyataha. It tells us more about the absolute truth. Right? So our journey begins, our inquiries begin with the first truth of God, and that is that everything comes from Him. He is the source of everything. So we said that Srimad Bhagavatam is a natural commentary on the Vedanta Sutras. So this statement, Janmadi Asiyataha, is also in the first verse of Srimad Bhagavatam. And of course, the same thing is stated by Krishna, slightly different words, but exactly the same thing in the 10th chapter, text 8 of Bhagavad Gita, where the Lord says that He is the source of everything material and spiritual. So the implication of this is very clear. If He is the one who everything emanates from, then we are the emanated. I may be equal to you in that stage, in that consideration, but we can't be equal to Him. He came from Him. The job of the emanator is already taken. It's already been done. We're already created. We can't go back and be Him. So we can also understand this in a different way. We take a cue now from the verses that we read last week from chapter 7. The Lord says that all the material energies are His, and all the spiritual energies are also His, all coming from Him. So my energies are also present in me. My energy to lift something, my energy to digest food, my energy to speak, my energy to stand, and all of those energies are serving me, right? They belong to me and they're there for my purpose. They can't. I'm just gonna get some data, if you don't mind, because this is a bit of a problem today. We are getting interrupted. Sorry about that. I'm not checking. Okay, sorry again, everyone. I've gotten some data, and so that we will not have this problem, hopefully, because the GPS has been cutting us off a lot. So, what we were saying was that all my powers are there to serve me. My power to sit, my power to stand, my power to eat, and so on. They can't be considered separate of me. So, in the same way, all the Lord's energies, material energies, spiritual energies, everything basically is emanating from Him as His energy. So, all of that is there to serve Him. That's just the reality. They're not equal to Him at all, but they're coming from Him. And this is the simultaneous oneness and difference, explained in a slightly different way. Shankara has falsely argued that if the transformation of energy is accepted, the supreme absolute truth cannot remain immutable. But this is not true. Despite the fact that unlimited energies are always being generated, the supreme absolute truth always remains the same. He is not affected by the emanations of unlimited energy. Shankaracharya has therefore incorrectly established his theory of illusion. Okay, so there's a lot of terms here, so we can try and explain it with an example, some drawings maybe. So the argument of Shankara. Now we know the reality is that all the energies of the Lord can come from Him, and the Lord can remain unchanged. Right? When us, as for example, as jivas are coming from the Supreme Lord, we get changed. That energy of the Lord changes to become us, right? And therefore, there's a distinction between the Lord and us. And that particular distinction is that we are very small. Okay? So we have the same qualities as the Lord, knowledge, eternity, and bliss, but we're very small. So as the energy is emanating from the Lord for us to be created, for example, there has to be a change. If there was no change, then we would be an incarnation of the Lord. And we certainly understand now There's a very big difference between the incarnations and us, right? So, for example, material nature is also an emanation from the Lord, but there's a change that happens in that energy that becomes material nature. And the distinction there is that the material nature is ignorance, it's not blissful, it's miserable, and it's temporary. So there's always differences between the energies that come out of the Lord and the Lord himself, but that doesn't mean that the Lord changes. Right? The differences happen to the energies to make them something else. Okay, I hope that was clear. But Shankara now, he says that if the Lord is creating energies from himself, that it means there must be some change happening to the Lord, meaning that perhaps the quantity of the Lord's energy is decreasing in order to produce all of that, right? So perhaps he's explaining this in terms of the law of conservation of energy. So we'll use that to try and understand what he means. So what does the law of conservation of energy state? It basically states that you have like a system and all the energy in there is constant, it stays the same. So it means that the energy can't become less and can't become more. If there's any changes that happen, perhaps the energy transforms into something else, but the actual total amount of energy remains the same. Okay, so Shankara thinks that the Lord's energy is like that. Okay, so we'll try and show it. I hope it'll be clear on the board. Just tell me if it's not, because I think this is better understood if there's some kind of like drawing of it. So say this, for example, a single mass of God energy, right? We'll call it X, and we'll call it P for total. Okay. So XP is all the energy in the God system, and it must remain constant. So it means that if God is going to produce energies like the material energy and like the spiritual energy, it means that basically, let's just assume an arbitrary value. God's going to lose this energy that is now becoming the material energy, and the spiritual energy. So now XP will become something else. Okay. It'll be made up of, let's say, XN for the new God, plus this material portion, and the spiritual energy. Spiritual energy will include us, it will include the spiritual world, and so on. Right? So all of that together now will equal to the energy in the system, right? To make sure that the energy stays constant, right? So now where we had like a whole God energy, now we have material energy, we have spiritual energy, and that's equal to the energy in the system. Okay, fair enough. But the problem is that it means that XN, right, the new form of God, has lost these energies. Okay, and it means that he's changed, and change is not allowed for God. Okay, the reason is that what we know from Scripture is that God is the absolute truth. Absolute means that no change is allowed. If something is changed, if something is added to it, something is subtracted to it, it means that it wasn't absolute. It wasn't always perfect, right? So the spiritual world, for example, is absolute. Everything is perfect. Nothing changes. Nothing needs to change because everything is perfect. But in the material world, everything is relative, right? In the material world, my identity may seem like it's absolute because, I mean, who else can I be but Gaura Premi Devi Dasi? But it's only absolute. Actually, it's not absolute. Sorry, it's relative. It's relative. Well, you may say, how can it be relative? What is it relative to? Okay, it's relative to time. I'm only Gaura Premi Devi Dasi now, in this time. But in a few years, if I move on to another body, then I become someone else. In that way, everything in this material world is relative. But in the spiritual world, everything is absolute. So therefore, the nature of God is immutable. He cannot change, he cannot mutate, he cannot become anything, because it means that who he wasn't correct, it wasn't right, it wasn't full. I hope this is making sense. So for Shankaracharya, it means God can't actually have anything emanating from him, because then he becomes less in some way. And mutation goes against the doctrine of the absolute truth. So how does he explain it all? So he explains that this whole XT, right, is actually Brahman. So somehow he wants us to believe that we've got somehow a big XT, right? This is the supreme Brahman. And we have lots of small XTs like us. Only he thinks that we're all merging or merged into this. And we'll, of course, understand the absurdity of it in a minute. And it can account for the spiritual side of things, because the spiritual nature can just be included in this big mass, because spiritual world, spirit souls, are all the same qualities of Brahman. So what about material nature? Clearly, material nature is not of the same quality of Brahman. So material nature can't exist here. How does he solve the problem of material nature? He just says it's not real. His simple explanation, and this is Mayavadis tell us, is that this whole material nature is not real. It doesn't exist, a figment of our imagination. So they still can't explain why it even exists, how it got here, what's its purpose. Certainly they can't explain why, if we're all existing within this Brahman and all apparently the same as this big Brahman, why did we fall into this illusion in the first place? How did it happen? Did the material energy kind of pick us out of here? Did we fall into material energy? They actually have no explanation at all. And we also discussed in the beginning of our class that if we have a state of illusion, then there must be a state of reality. So for Mayavadis, if this material world is an illusion, then there must also be a reality. Okay. So they say that their reality is that they become Brahman, but they can't prove it, because when they attain that state of Brahman in these present bodies, they don't become anything different. We said that they don't possess any greater powers, greater abilities, and so on. Right? They can't prove that they've even attained what they claim is reality. Devotees, on the other hand, we know that the material world is real. We're seeing it, we're feeling it, we're tasting it, we're touching it, we're experiencing everything in the material world all the time. Where the illusion comes in is that we think that this is our home. We think this is where we belong. We think that it's real. We think in terms of that it's our reality, sorry. We think that we belong here. Right? That's where the illusion comes in. Now, when we get that knowledge and we understand that it's not, we start engaging, making progress, and then developing pure devotional service, then the reality does become obvious, right? The reality is that anyone who is purely involved in devotional service comes under the protection of the spiritual nature, and then, of course, they are practically living that spiritual nature, and we can see that pure devotees, they do change, they do exhibit, like we speaking last week, or the previous week, about the extraordinary abilities of spiritual teachers, how they can write so much literature that's humanly not possible, especially like Bhaktivinoda Thakur had so many responsibilities and jobs and so on. And not only the devotees, but the Supreme Lord himself. He also comes here and he's able to do supernatural things. So this is proof that there is a spiritual world, that there is a reality beyond the illusion of the material world. This is something that the Mayavadis cannot demonstrate to us. They can't demonstrate their reality. So we've therefore said that there are 4 points, right, amongst the many that they can't prove. That they can't prove that this material world is unreal. They can't say why it came about. They can't say how the living entity, they can't say why the material nature came about, nor can they say, demonstrate what their reality is. Then as far as the living entity falling into avidya, Sri Prabhupada has told us already that they don't know that either, right? They just say living entity fell into avidya, but they can't say how. They don't know themselves. So there's many plot holes, as they say, more than answers, actually. And it's very surprising because this philosophy of Mayavad is very popular, wildly popular. And simply, we can say it's just out of laziness that people state all is one without understanding that it doesn't make sense. Okay. The reality is that in the spiritual world, in the material world, there's conservation of energy. That's because the material energy is limited. So certainly we can have such equations apply here. But in the spiritual world, everything's unlimited. And Krishna is fully spiritual. So all his energies are unlimited, right? He's unlimited. So it means that no matter how many jivas he creates, no matter how many material universes there are, and no matter how much the spiritual world is actually infinite, the Lord himself is unchanged and infinite as well, right? Anything can actually emanate from him and not change him. This is the reality of spirit. So we can't use material equations to understand the Lord, nor is the Lord subject to material equations. If he's subject to material equations or material energy, then he is under the spell of material energy, right? And this is why Srila Prabhupada called them Mayavadis, because they're believing basically that Maya is stronger than God, if they're saying that he's under Maya's control or subject to Maya's energy. Ramanuja has discussed this point very nicely. One may argue, since there was only one absolute truth before the creation of this material world, how is it possible that the living entities emanated from him? If he were alone, how could he have produced or generated the infinitesimal living entities? In answer to this question, the Vedas state that everything is generated from the absolute truth, everything is maintained by the absolute truth, and after annihilation, everything enters into the absolute truth. This statement from the Upanishads makes it clear that when the living entities are liberated, they enter into the supreme existence without changing their original constitutional position. So we understand clearly from these statements that the material world is real. Right? It may be temporary, but it is real. And that when the living entities fall from the spiritual world into illusion, they can still go back. They can still retain their identities as servants again. They just need to uncover it. We must always remember that the Supreme Lord has his creative function and that the infinitesimal living entities have their creative functions also. It's not that their creative function is lost when they are liberated and enter into the Supreme after the dissolution of the material body. On the contrary, the creative function of the living entity is properly manifested in the liberated state. If the living entity's activities are manifested even when he is materially conditioned, then how is it possible for his activities to stop when he attains liberation? The living entities entering the state of liberation may be compared to a bird entering a tree, or an animal entering the forest, or a plane entering the sky. In no case are activities stopped. So we stated before many times that the soul is constantly active. Activity can never stop for the soul. In addition, last week we said that the soul has desires, and the soul has desires because Krishna has desires. The small soul is exhibiting the qualities of the Lord just in a very small way. Now the Srila Prabhupada is saying that the Lord has creative functions, so we also have creative functions. So with all this activity, all this desire, all this creative function within the soul, we can't think that it will stop in some way when the soul gets to the Brahman. Okay, the state of the soul getting to Brahman, if one follows the Mayavad path, is described here with three analogies. We'll take the one of a bird entering a tree. A green bird will enter a green tree, and then it appears like it's disappeared. Okay, but the bird is still a bird. It's still in the tree. It hasn't become part of the tree. It's still able to carry out its bird function. So in the same way, we can enter into Brahman, the soul can enter, but the soul doesn't become one with Brahman. It just remains in the vicinity of Brahman, just like the bird is in the tree. But it's still holding on to its desires, it's still holding on to its creative functions. But in the most terrible way, it doesn't have a body to express, doesn't have a mind to express it. So we can understand that this is not a sustainable position, not a comfortable position. It's not a position that the living entity will be able to remain in. Right? When explaining the second aphorism of Vedanta Sutra, Shankara has most unceremoniously tried to explain that Brahman, or the Supreme Absolute Truth, is impersonal. He has also cunningly tried to switch the doctrine of byproducts into the doctrine of change. For the Supreme Truth, there is no change. It is simply that a byproduct results from his inconceivable powers of action. In other words, a relative truth, a byproduct, is produced out of the Supreme Lord. Right? So we are relative to the Lord. Small Brahman and he is great Brahman. For example, when a chair is produced out of crude wood, it is said that a byproduct is produced. The Supreme Absolute Truth Brahman is immutable. And when we find a byproduct, the living entity or the cosmic manifestation is the transformation of the Lord, the Supreme's energies, or a byproduct of the Supreme. It is like milk being transformed into yogurt. Okay, so there's two nice examples here that we'll finish with. So the chair is a transformation of wood. Okay, the chair has the same properties of wood, right? It can be burned in fire, it has the same texture and so on, but it's a transformation. It can't go back to being wood, right? So in the same way, milk can be transformed into yogurt. The yogurt can't go back to being milk anymore. It shares some properties with the milk, but it's not the same entity, right? So this is us. We get transformed out of the Lord's energy into something else. But whereas in the case of milk and in the case of wood, which are of course material things, and they obey the law of conservation of energy, it means that some wood is now missing from the original body of wood. It means that some milk is less being transformed. But in the spiritual sense, right, the Lord is unlimited. He's not like wood and he's not like milk. No matter how much living entities, no matter how much material nature, whatever comes out of him, he always remains the same and he's always unlimited. The quantity of him or his power is never decreased. Okay. So thank you all so much for your patience. I know there was a lot to take in and your kind attention. We will continue with this discussion next week. And please join us there. Shiva Prabhupada ki jai, Shri Gaura Hari ki jai. Are there any questions or comments, anything that I should clarify or any corrections?
Hi, Krishna Maji. Thank you for the wonderful class.
Thank you, Shubha. Thank you for the service.
Yeah, Maji, you're talking about the ego in terms of spiritual, our right identity, and you're talking about our, how we carried ourselves in our normal duties. So how do we, how can we master that in terms of thinking on the soul perspective? I know you mentioned some points, but is there any quick tips that you can give us so we don't forget our real identity?
So we will only know our real identity when we get to the level of Asakti proper. But in getting there, we can we have a lot of wonderful ways in which we can get there. We can be clear of the material contamination, the false ego, right? And those are the practices of, like the Bhagavatam says, hearing Srimad Bhagavatam, serving with devotees, Nityam Bhagavata Sevaya. So we serve the devotees, we hear from the devotees, associate with the devotees, we hear Srimad Bhagavatam, right? We hear our chanting attentively. We go to holy places and we serve the deity. Those are some of the ways, the most potent ways, and there are many other ways. So we get clear of all this contamination of the false ego. So those verses actually in the second canto, first canto, second chapter, those series of verses, they actually are explaining how we're progressing from passion and ignorance through these processes up to the level of goodness. So we're actually trying to at least get to goodness, and that will make us more conscious of it. So we can help ourselves to do that by just being more conscious in all our activities. Because the problem is that we're all sort of unconsciously going around in passion and ignorance, and we're not aware that we're acting according to the false ego. So besides our obvious activities of devotional service, we can become more conscious in those activities. This actually situates us a lot closer to the mode of goodness by doing that. So of course, the most important thing is when we're chanting is we're attentive. That's how we're being conscious of the chanting. As we pay attention to the chanting, when we're listening to anyone speak Bhagavatam, we are hearing properly. When we're serving the devotees, right, we understand the principles of how to serve devotees. We know that we have to be respectful to our superiors. We know that we have to be friendly to those on the same level as us. We know that we have to be merciful to those who are junior to us. And we know that we have to avoid the envious. Okay, so we have to follow these principles. We have to take direction from our spiritual teachers, how we can serve the holy dance. We can go to the holy dance, serve the deity, and always getting guidance from our spiritual masters to help us with this consciousness. So it actually means that we have to slow down. Before Swami Maharaj is actually explaining it, it means we have to slow down. To be in the mode of goodness actually means that we're more deliberate in whatever we do. And rushing around is a function of the mode of passion, and being indolent, really not doing much at all. That's the mode of rushing around is mode of passion, okay, and not doing anything, of course, is the mode of ignorance, right? Being indolent and lazy. So we want to be deliberate. There's a difference, and if we try to practice this, being deliberate in our daily lives, actually considering what we're doing when we're doing it, actually considering what we're saying to someone before we say it, considering our intentions. This will help us situate ourselves more in goodness. The closer we get to goodness, the closer we get to the level of being in the transcendental state. And this is what eventually we want to achieve, where, as Bhagavatam explains, the knots in the heart are cut and all the misgivings are gone. And in that transcendental state, you can actually render your devotional service to the Lord. So all the spiritual activities must be there, the guidance from the spiritual master, and of course the scripture must be there, and we must be more deliberate, more conscious, basically. Is that okay, Prabhu?
Hare Krishna Maharaj, thank you so much.
Thank you, Prabhu. Are there any other questions or comments, corrections? If there are none, then we will sing our bhajan today. It's a very nice bhajan by Srila Bhaktivinoda Thakur. And we're going to try and accompany it with harmonium this time. I hope that the sound will be not be overpowering. So this is a very famous bhajan. It's a very beautiful bhajan. It has a very deep meaning. And it actually has 3 parts. It's quite long. We will probably sing it over 3 weeks. So this is just the first part, these 8 verses. And we will try to invite the meaning as well. So let's begin. Amara barasa tumi, tomara charane, loinu sharana, tomara charane, loinu sharana, tomara kinsora gopina, kemone shodibe more. Na jani bhakti, karane chatmati. Na jani bhakti, karane chatmati. Pure shri samsara bhore, gopina. Sakali samara maya, nahi mama bhala. Jnana sunirvana, nahi mama bhala. Jnana sunirvana, varina nage katya. Gopina, niyata charana stana, mage samara. Kandiya kandiya, mage samara. Kandiya kandiya, korai karuna dana. Gopina, tumi to sakari pare, dojane karike. Tumhara sakati dojane karike, tumhara sakati ke aasha patira aaro. Gopina, tumi kripa parabara, jivera karane, atiya prapanche jivera karane, atiya prapanche lila parile subhita. Gopina, aniki doshi doshi, asura sakala, paila chalana, asura sakala, paila chalana, dina daita kira voshi. Gopina, Gopina, invocation. O Gopinath, Lord of the Gopis, please hear my request. I am a wicked materialist, always addicted to worldly desires, and no good qualities do I possess. O Gopinath, you are my only hope, and therefore I have taken shelter at your lotus feet. I am now your eternal servant. O Gopinath, how will you purify me? I do not know what devotion is, and my materialistic mind is absorbed in spiritual work. I have fallen into this dark and terrorless worldly existence. O Gopinath, everything here is your illusory energy. I have no strength or transcendental knowledge, and this body of mine is not independent and free from the control of material nature. O Gopinath, the sinner who is weeping and weeping begs for an eternal place at your divine feet. Please give him your mercy. O Gopinath, you are able to do anything, and therefore you have the power to deliver all sinners. Who is there that is more of a sinner than myself? O Gopinath, you are the ocean of mercy. Having come into this phenomenal world, you expand your divine pastimes for the sake of the fallen souls. O Gopinath, I am so sinful that although all the demons attained your lotus feet, Bhaktivinoda has remained in worldly existence. Shri Shri Radha Gopinath ki jai, Shri Bhaktivinoda Thakur ki jai, Shri Prabhupada ki jai, Shri Gaura Premi Devi Dasi. So again, thank you all so much for joining us, and please do join us next week. Hare Krishna.
Hare Krishna, Maji, thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Mataji.
Hare Krishna, everyone. Thank you.